Good afternoon, good morning to whoever is joining us today. We are so excited to be bringing this event to you all on hopefully what's a beautiful Friday for you all as well. I just wanted to, we're going to keep waiting for everybody to come into the room, but as you are making your way in here, we would love to welcome you to drop your name, your organization, and where you're tuning in from into the chat. We know that this is definitely going to be centered around Pennsylvania, but we welcome everybody from across the country who's interested in this issue and propelling it to the forefront of our local and state policy agendas. So give folks just a few minutes to continue coming into the room. And while everyone is getting situated, I also want to introduce myself. My name is Jasmine Ringel. I'm a senior associate here on the housing team at PolicyLink. Have been working very closely with Community Legal Services of Philadelphia for the last 2 years on this issue, and I'm so excited to bring this information to you all with some incredible special guests for today. Today we'll be hearing from a variety of different people across the state of Pennsylvania, and also some advocates who were in Pennsylvania from before. We're going to, I will walk us through the agenda in a little bit, but just some minor housekeeping. Please feel free to utilize the Q&A box for any questions that come up throughout the presentation. We will be sending out a recording of this webinar, the slides, and resources, as well as a post-webinar survey. So please be on the lookout for that email after the webinar. And utilize the chat as much as you need to also ask questions or to connect with each other, or just to put in your thoughts about what you're hearing today. We'll be hearing from Rashida Phillips in a bit to help ground us in this moment, this issue, and what their future holds for all of us. We'll also be hearing from Representative Ismail Izzy Smith-Waddell on why we need to be paying attention to this issue. We'll also be grounding ourselves in the latest eviction data in Pennsylvania, so that we really understand what the extent of this issue is. We will also be hearing from an impacted Pittsburgh tenant, Haley Passion, and then hearing from CLS on what they've seen in court and from various tenants. We'll be ending with a Q&A as well, and our final remarks for you all. And so just so we can start to ground ourselves in a tenant's experience dealing with an eviction and eviction records, we're going to start with a short video.
My eviction happened, it was 2015. I was living in Houston, Texas. My hours got cut at work, so I was a month behind in my rent, and I ended up getting evicted. I was served a paper to go to court. I couldn't make it to the court. I didn't have a car at the time. So the court appearance, it wasn't somewhere that was located on a bus line. So after that, I received an eviction notice that I had to move. But by the time they tacked on court fees, attorney fees, I ended up having to pay over $2,000. That's what's showing up on my credit report, and my rent was only $725. It's tough. I mean, like I said, I was living in my car. I lost my kids behind it, and we're not judged fairly. We get looked down upon, and it's not fair. I was calling around to different agencies, trying to get assistance. I can't remember the exact name of this one particular one that I called, but when I showed up there, they're the ones that had called CYS and told them that I didn't have anywhere to go. It was hard. I had missed like their first steps. They had a birthday that came around, and they didn't spend like that actual day with me. It was after the fact when I had a scheduled visit that I saw. Even me like going to work, it was difficult because I had car issues sometimes, and I had somebody say, well, I can give you a ride home, but I didn't have a home. That was my home. During the summertime, it was hot, but I was trying not to run my air conditioner so that my gas wouldn't run out. I was having to eat Wawa or fast food a lot because, of course, I had no refrigerator or anything to store food. Looking for housing here, I ended up staying with a friend of mine, and it was an uncomfortable situation. She didn't have room at her house, so me looking for somewhere to go, I was automatically denied for most places because of the eviction, even though it was long ago and it happened in a different state. Some places wanted an extra security deposit on top of what I would have already had to pay. I didn't have that type of money, so I ended up finding a private landlord. It makes you feel defeated and hopeless, like you feel stuck, like you have no help, nowhere to turn to, all because of something that happened years ago. And even if a landlord files an eviction and it never gets to the point where the judge says you're evicted, you have to leave, that still shows up on your record and it follows you. I am someone that I do pay my rent and other bills. I work Monday through Friday. I'm just a single parent out here trying to make it, take care of my kids, and keep a roof over their heads.
So with that, and thank you so much, CLS, for putting together that video and for bringing forward Jennifer's story. I want to welcome our Director of Housing, Rashida Phillips, to say some words. Rashida leads our national advocacy at PolicyLink to grow the tenants' rights, housing and land use movements in partnership with grassroots partners, movement leaders, industry, and government leaders. Previously, Rashida has served as managing attorney of housing policy at Community Legal Services of Philadelphia, and they've led various housing policy campaigns that have resulted in significant legislative changes, including a right to counsel for tenants in Philadelphia and the Renters Access Act, one of the strongest laws in the nation to address blanket ban eviction policies. Thank you so much, Rashida, for being here.
Thank you for having me, and hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us during this pivotal event. As we gather virtually from our locations, I just want to sort of ground us in the shared vision that is bringing us together. A future where housing is not just a basic need, but is a foundational element of health, of community, and a catalyst for liberatory and reparative spatial justice. So today we're here to challenge those old paradigms and to champion new models and frameworks for housing. These frameworks are designed to be unapologetically inclusive, sustainable, and capable of adapting to the dynamic needs of our future. As you just heard from the story from Jennifer, right? Like, we need these new models. We need these things that undo our assumptions about people and about something that happens in a snapshot, you know, in a moment of somebody's life that continues to sit with them and be a part of their record forever. And so our efforts are really driven by that brilliance, by the brilliance and insights of those who have been most impacted by systemic housing inequities. And by centering and following their leadership, following their examples, we embed principles of spatial justice and housing justice deep within the fabric of our communities. And so I just want to share, we at PolicyLink have something called Housing Futures Month that we celebrate every April, and that builds on the legacy of Fair Housing Month. And so this event is part of that. And Fair Housing Month, Housing Futures Month, it's observed every April. Fair Housing Month started, after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the passage of the Fair Housing Act in April of 1968. And so all of these things, right, underscore the transformative role of housing, whether it's the Fair Housing Act, Fair Housing Month, or Housing Futures Month. It really tries to underscore how housing shapes our lives, shapes our communities. And so this month really calls on us to take action. It urges each of us to consider how we might contribute to housing models that offer everybody, not just a select few, that stability and space to dream and pursue bold futures, whatever that may mean for them, for their families, and for their communities. And at the core of this conversation today, what we're here to talk about today are the critical issues surrounding eviction records. And we at PolicyLink see eviction records as a fair housing issue that necessitates our urgent attention. As you would have read, if you've seen the report that CLS and PolicyLink put out, we know that the people most impacted by evictions and therefore eviction records are typically people of color, low-income people, and other people who are facing other types of inequities are the people with disabilities, other people, right, that face these inequities. And so we see fair housing as a part of how we deal with eviction records and how we address them. And across the nation, right, millions, again, because of whatever circumstances, are facing barriers due to tenant screening practices that unjustly emphasize those past eviction records, that unjustly emphasize that snapshot, that moment of time where you had a family member pass or you switched jobs or whatever it may have been. That is, again, just a moment in time that then has to follow you for the rest of your life because of the sort of practices that we have embedded in our systems. And so such practices not only undermine people's access to housing, but also perpetuates the cycles of poverty and exclusion that we see today. And so as we delve deeper into today's discussion, I hope that we're guided by a commitment to fairness, to equity, to the visionary thinking that is necessary to reimagine and rebuild the systems that shape our lives and our environments. And through these efforts, right, through collaboration and through community, we can transform that landscape of housing into one that truly reflects the value of justice and inclusivity. So I thank you all for your commitment. I thank you all for being here today, for your participation in this very, very important discussion, and hope that together we can forge paths towards futures where people have the right and the means to secure safe, stable, and supportive living environments. Thank you so much. And now I'm going to pass it to Holly Beck, and just to share who Holly is, she's a divisional supervising attorney in the housing unit at Community Legal Services, where she focuses on providing advice and representation to tenants facing eviction and other forms of housing instability. She also leads the housing unit's work on inequitable impacts of eviction records and tenant screening practices. Before joining CLS, Holly represented low-income parents involved in New York City's child welfare system, first as an attorney at Bronx Defenders, and then as a supervising attorney at Neighborhood Defender Service of Harlem. Holly also served as legislative counsel at the New York City Council, where she drafted legislation and advised elected officials. So I'll pass it to you now, Holly. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rashida. Thank you all for being here. I'll be speaking with you more later about my experience representing tenants in landlord-tenant court. But for now, I'm going to introduce our next speaker, who is Lancaster's newly elected, well, not newly elected, 2 years ago, serving his first term as state representative for Lancaster, Representative Ismail Izzy Smith-Waddell. Prior to his elevation to the state legislature, Rep. Izzy was the president of the Lancaster City Council, where he served since 2017. And during his time on council, Rep. Izzy secured the largest investments in affordable housing and lead removal for the city of Lancaster in its entire history. I'm so honored to work with Rep. Izzy, who is the prime sponsor on the House bill that would seal so many eviction records in Pennsylvania. And he's here to speak with us all about why the need is so strong. So take it away, Rep. Izzy.
Hey, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much, Holly. It is an equal honor to be in this work with you, and thank you. I think Holly, I will say, really undersells how important she is to the process that we're working on, which is making eviction record sealing the law of the land in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, which is what we're all here to talk about. So the bill HB 1769 would do a couple of things, which would be really a seismic shift in not just how we treat evictions, but also how we ensure that our tenants have access to housing in a way that they're not haunted by their past, in a way that's actually really in line with the stated values of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania and, frankly, the legislature at the General Assembly. So the bill does three things. One, at the time of filing, the eviction records, files related to a landlord-tenant case would become shielded from general public view. What does that mean? So in the time when a tenant is most vulnerable, when they're moving from one housing situation to another, they're not going to be struck off by an eviction record or a record of a filing which has not even been concluded yet. Thing two, The bill provides for the sealing of eviction records when a judgment is satisfied. So let's say that your landlord filed against you for back rent in the amount of $1,800. Once you've satisfied the judgment, that should no longer follow you around for 5, 7, 10 years, making it hard to access housing. And so it would provide for that. And then finally, it would provide a 7-year timeline after which all eviction records become limited access, breaking into the ground that has already been cleared in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania by the landmark clean slate legislation, but doing the same for folks' eviction records. And we know, what clean slate can do for folks in accessing employment, for example. This can do for something that is equally, if not more important, which is making sure that folks have housing. So I've jumped ahead a little bit. Let's go back, because I want to be clear, as many of you well know already, but I want to be explicit about how important and how impactful eviction records are. So if you've ever seen the background check that a landlord or a property manager or a company might pull on a tenant, there's usually a section that says landlord tenant or landlord tenant filings, court filings, eviction filings, something like that. I've seen many of these. And the information that they include is often that there was a filing and the date of the filing. They do not indicate whether or not it was a non-payment eviction. If it was a non-payment eviction, they do not indicate whether it was over $5, $5,000, or $50,000. They do not indicate any special circumstances, such as the presence of domestic violence or intimate partner violence in the case, which we know drives eviction and houselessness for thousands of people across the Commonwealth every year. And this is the part that really gets me. It does not indicate whether or not the judge found in favor of the tenant. Now, as we well know, many landlords, many property management companies are flush with applicants. And so they're looking for any reason to strike off an applicant. So this situation, combined with the laws of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, means that there are people being denied housing for evictions that never even actually happen. Like that's the baseline that I want to draw for us. So many records, when they come through to a person making a housing decision, are incomplete or inaccurate to the point where they simply don't know what occurred or even if it actually occurred. And so we are making people homeless in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And some number of them were never even actually evicted. And that's both bad and easy to fix. In keeping with our commitments to principles like racial and economic justice, we should also be aware of the stark disproportionality of the ways in which evictions and eviction records affect Black women, they affect Latinx women, and particularly their children. I think, as we all know on this call, the person most likely to be evicted in the United States and indeed in the Commonwealth is a child. And so why pass this bill? Why fight for this bill? If we need a better reason, frankly, than preventing families with children, working people, survivors of domestic violence, and children from homelessness, we could find one, but I think you'd be hard-pressed to find a better reason to accomplish really any task. In addition to its sort of obvious moral entry, like why do this? Because it's the right thing to do, and why do this? Because it's a series of fairly simple technical changes that would provide for the safety and housing of thousands of Pennsylvanians. As many as 20%, frankly, of the landlord-tenant filings every year that don't end in an adjudication against the tenant. It's protecting those tenants in the near term, and it's protecting everybody in the long term. Beyond that, it provides us a wedge and a window into making housing justice more of a legislative priority in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, when we can talk to people about their friends and neighbors and the simple principles of fairness and second chances, and when we can get people to realize that those apply to housing as well, I think we have the opportunity to build a much larger movement around housing, around evictions, and around access, and indeed to educate people. We talk about this in terms of education, and we talk about it in terms of criminal justice. But as was mentioned, the last great victory of the civil rights movement was the Fair Housing Act. When we talk about following in the footsteps of civil rights greats, making sure that racial justice also means spatial justice, which is a phrase I learned 10 minutes ago and love, thank you very much, really is the next thing that we can do to protect civil rights and justice here in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And so where the bill stands right now, we've been referred to the Judiciary Committee because the bill amends court proceedings. That bill is HB 1769, and we would love for you to be contacting each and every one of your legislators, whether they're on the Judiciary Committee or not, and letting them know that this bill is an important step for fairness and justice in the Commonwealth, and you want to see them supported, and you want to see the bill passed into law. The other thing that you can do, make sure that your friends, your neighbors, the institutions that you work with understand both the depth of what an eviction can do to a household and family, and the ways in which people can thrive when they have a second chance at housing. We're working really hard. We're doing events all over the Commonwealth to make sure that folks are aware of eviction record sealing and what it can do for their families, their neighbors, and their friends. And we hope that you will join us as friends in the fight. Okay, that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. I guess questions now while I have a couple of minutes.
Thank you so much, Rep. Izzy. There is one, we will have time for question and answer a bit later. There is one question in the chat, but I might ask if we can save that for the Q&A a bit later in the program. And for now, I'm gonna thank you so much, Rep. Izzy, for everything you're doing to push this forward and for your remarks today. And I'm gonna hand it back to Jasmine.
Yeah, thank you so much, Holly. And thank you so much, Rep. Izzy, for the work that you're doing to elevate this issue in such a large area where so much change can happen, and bringing so many tenant stories to life through this legislation. So I want to bring us through some data grounding for just a couple of minutes. So back in the fall of 2013, we released a joint report with Community Legal Services of Philadelphia to unlock the potential, about unlocking the potential for housing stability and economic prosperity in Pennsylvania by illuminating the detrimental effects that eviction records have on individuals and communities. Today, we'd love to make sure that we reground ourselves in the state of evictions in Pennsylvania and the precedents that have been set in the state and across the country that can catalyze this current effort to seal eviction records and provide a timely solution for Pennsylvanians across various backgrounds. So prior to the pandemic, from 2016 to 2020, the annual average evictions filed throughout Pennsylvania was over 114,000, which was fewer than the total number of eviction filings in the first 2 years of the pandemic combined, as we see here in this graph. An average of 61% of those pre-pandemic filings were disproportionately filed against women. This figure right here is showcasing eviction filings in Pennsylvania from 2020 to 2023. And we can clearly see that since the pandemic, there's been a quick increase in evictions back to and exceeding what we previously rationalized as quote unquote normal. Next slide, please. So it's really hard to ignore our post-pandemic reality. Throughout 2023, filing rates in Pennsylvania were back to pre-pandemic averages and exceeding those averages in some months. Here, this figure illustrates recent eviction filings in Pennsylvania in orange, so those are the recent ones, compared to the historical averages in gray. And as this figures show, some monthly filing averages in 2023, such as January, February, March, October, November, and December, may I remind you, those are all very cold months in Pennsylvania. These months have met, if not exceeded, historical monthly filing averages. And before the pandemic, we would have seen much less evictions than we're seeing now. 2024 is also starting to show similar trends to 2023, as we can see in January, which had filings that barely exceeded historical filing averages, and in the month of February, where filings have well exceeded historical filing averages. Next slide, please. And eviction rates throughout or prior to the pandemic were also larger in less populated suburban areas like York County, Lehigh County, Dauphin County, and Berks County, compared to city centers such as Pittsburgh or Philadelphia, which is against typically what we think is happening. And while eviction rates in 2022 varied across the Commonwealth, there are notable outliers in places like Lycoming County and Monroe County. And as this figure illustrates here, evictions are not an urban problem, but an increasing problem for all of our communities as it's spread to rural areas as well. Further, recent research from the Eviction Lab has showcased that evictions are becoming an even larger problem for suburban and rural communities. For example, in Harrisburg and Pittsburgh, the share of evictions in the suburban counties of these metro areas has increased 11% and 5% respectively. Next slide, please. Just in the past year, from March 2023 to February 2024, landlords have filed over 116,000 eviction filings, a total that's inching towards drastically exceeding the historical pre-pandemic average. But what does any of this really mean? Ample research shows that evictions cause a host of detrimental conditions, detrimental outcomes to the youngest to the oldest in our communities, and everyone in between. Most of these outcomes also start snowballing from the moment that an eviction is filed and a record is created, showcasing that evictions are not episodic life events. A single eviction record can cause irreparable harm to the lives of mothers and their children, disrupt workforce development for large swaths of communities, and strain existing social support systems throughout the states for years in the future. Furthermore, because evictions are disproportionately filed against Black and Latinx women, eviction records pose a major fair housing issue. This is especially concerning as eviction records are increasingly becoming a modern problem because of easy access to records through online databases and more landlords and consumer reporting agencies employing automated algorithmic tenant screening measures. And these trends are not unique to Pennsylvania. They're similar in states and communities across the country. So what do we do about this? Next slide, please. So the precedent is set not only in Pennsylvania, but also in states across the country. During the first 6 months of the pandemic, Pennsylvania policymakers hurried into action. They passed a host of policies such as eviction moratoriums, eviction diversion programs, and emergency rental assistance, leading to record low eviction filings across the state. Clearly, the pandemic showed how important it is to protect the stability and livelihood of renters. Post-pandemic Pennsylvania communities deserve the same level of protections, considerations, and commitments. Over 10 states across the country have also taken these learnings into account and started to provide avenues for tenants to seal or expunge their current eviction records. They've seen it as a common sense and immediately impactful way to prevent eviction records from haunting people for years by protecting them from discrimination and long-term housing insecurity. They've seen how this policy can protect renters in the short term and pave the way for equitable housing and health outcomes for residents of all backgrounds. And as Rep. Izzy mentioned, Pennsylvania has set a pivotal precedent already to protect people's futures from being dictated by their past. Pennsylvania was the first state to automatically seal criminal records, allowing for more than 1 million Pennsylvanians to have a fresh start and access to family-sustaining jobs. The same can be done with eviction records. Pennsylvania can build upon the existing precedents across the state and nation to pass a policy that seals eviction records and protects the housing stability and future of everyone in the Commonwealth. Next slide, please. And now we've heard from Jennifer about her harrowing troubles after an eviction and with an eviction record. And I'd love to welcome another tenant to speak about her experience. So Haley Passione, thank you so much for being here. Haley is a 2018 graduate from the University of Nevada, Reno with a bachelor's in political science. She will soon graduate from the University of Pittsburgh with a master's in higher education administration. Currently, Haley works for Rent Help PGH as a court resource navigator and helps tenants access rental assistance and legal aid resources for their eviction hearings. Haley is passionate about working with tenants and preventing eviction. Preventing eviction comes from her own lived experience of having an eviction complaint filed against her in 2020. Due to these combined experiences, she understands that there's often much more to an eviction complaint than what appears on a court docket and is a strong supporter of the Ready to Rent Act. Thank you so much, Haley. I'll pass it on to you.
Hi, everyone. First of all, thank you to PolicyLink and Community Legal Services for asking me to speak during this webinar. And thank you to Rep. Izzy for sponsoring this legislation and bringing this issue to the forefront. I'm going to talk a little bit today about my own personal experience as a tenant who does have a past eviction complaint on my record. And I'll touch a little bit on my current work at Rent Help Pittsburgh, where I help tenants avoid eviction. So before I get into my own experience, I want to frame it a little bit. So just a little bit more about myself. I have lived in Pittsburgh since 2018. I've been renting in the city ever since then. And I've also been a renter for about 10 years. I've been renting since I was 18 years old. I do work full-time at Rent Help Pittsburgh. I also have a part-time job where between the two, I expect to probably make close to $55,000, $60,000 this year. I have good credit. I have access to a cosigner if I ever need it for housing purposes. Currently I live alone, but I've generally rented with roommates, which, provides some more income for, covering rent and other bills. But despite all of that, I have been denied housing, and that is due to a previous eviction record on my record. So back in 2020, I lived in a home in the Bloomfield neighborhood of Pittsburgh. My roommates and I moved in 2019. And shortly after we moved in, we started experiencing some habitability issues. We had a roof that leaked pretty severely. It would leak all the way from our third floor to the second floor at one point, just with heavy rains in the summer. We discovered that several of the bedrooms and another room on the second floor of the house just didn't have heat. There was no ductwork in place in order for there to be heat in those spaces. One of those was my own bedroom. Also in my bedroom, there was a window that wasn't sealed properly, so there was just cold air coming in. There was a bathroom that just didn't work. The shower had no water to it. There was a sink that just didn't get hot water, as well as just some other various issues. And we tried to have our property management fix it. We would call them, we would email them, we would call and then send a follow-up email. We would submit maintenance requests, and they all just kind of went unanswered. At one point, someone did come and look at the roof, and they just put a tarp on it to prevent the rain from coming in. So I would say that we were kind of lucky because there were 3 of us. We were all in school together. We kind of knew what resources we had to reach out to find out how to kind of rectify these issues, which in my experience, a lot of tenants who are experiencing habitability issues, they don't even know who to reach out to when their landlord is being unresponsive. But we, reached out to some people. I believe we spoke to Neighborhood Legal Services, which is legal aid here in Pittsburgh. And we were advised that we did, you know, have the right to start withholding rent if we were experiencing habitability issues, and we did decide to go through with that. We had submitted complaints to the health department, and they did come and they did eventually deem the house unfit for human habitation. So that was the point where we decided to start withholding rent, because we had that kind of verification. And so it was in October of 2019 that we started withholding. And in January of 2020, our landlord did file for an eviction against us. So we went to court. We kept all the money. We had it in a savings account so we could, you know, prove that we weren't just not paying rent. We had the money. We were just withholding. And we had 2 court hearings because we did file a counterclaim against our landlord. And eventually the case was found in our favor. So it was judged for defendant. We did not owe our landlord any money. They were not granted any opportunity to take possession of the home from us. But prior to that, we really didn't know what was going to happen. We had started looking at other places to live in case we did have to move out. We were considering, you know, just breaking the lease and moving, but we did only have a few months left on our lease, so we didn't really want to leave if we didn't have to. We did, like I said, we filed a counterclaim that actually was found in our favor as well. Our landlord was supposed to pay us a little bit of money. They never did. And we did move out in June of 2020. And at that point, still nothing had been fixed, despite the court case going in our favor and there being, you know, proof from the health department and everything that there were pretty severe habitability issues happening. And to this day, it is difficult and very stressful, you know, trying to find housing because of that experience. I will say I've never had a landlord directly outright tell me that that's why they're denying housing. But I have tried the technique of being upfront with landlords about the fact that, you know, there is an eviction filing. It was found in our favor. You know, I have documentation of why we were taken to court and all of that. And upon disclosing, you know, it's kind of gone the way of not being approved for the housing that myself and a roommate are applying for. It's a waste of time. It's a waste of money for myself and other tenants who, you know, have these eviction records or eviction complaints on our records, especially for those of us who were never actually evicted. But then I will say my experience with this is the reason that I was interested in working in my current position. I've been at Rent Help for about 10 months. And I have the absolute privilege of being an advocate for tenants who are in eviction court. At Rent Help, I'm a court resource navigator. So we work in 4 of the highest filing courts in Allegheny County. I'm in court 1 to 2 times a week in one of those 4 courts. I have a few numbers here where in Allegheny County, there's about 14,000 evictions filed every year. And the courts that we're in make up about 43% of those filings. So we're seeing a lot of tenants, some tenants more than once, but a lot of times it's a first filing. And we are able to help people by getting them rental assistance and also getting them legal aid resources. So having an attorney to actually represent them in their hearing, or for tenants who are experiencing an issue with a subsidy or their SSI benefits are cut off and they're trying to appeal or something like that, connecting them with an attorney who can help them through that process and help them, you know, figure things out. But so in our courts, we get about 50% favorable outcomes for tenants. And by that, I mean, the court judges it for the tenant, so in their favor, or it's withdrawn, dismissed, or settled. So again, there's no actual even chance of an eviction taking place. Across the county, the number for favorable outcomes is about 14%. So we're pretty proud of, you know, that number of favorable outcomes. And then I do know that even in cases that go to judgment, a money judgment, the number goes up to about 60% of cases where we're able to get that judgment satisfied and, you know, help them avoid eviction. And I do know that in our county, a lot of times it's just for non-payment. 90% of the cases we see in the county are just for arrears, just for back owed rent. And I would say the biggest thing I've taken from this position is that non-payment is really just never that simple. We see tenants who dad got sick and they've been taking care of them, so they've been working less, or they lost their job, or they're having an issue with their subsidy. I've been in court where one property manager filed, and then the property manager who's in court is like, actually, this tenant has a zero balance. I'm not sure why they're even here. And so that speaks to where a case can really be filed for anything, whether it's legitimate or not. And then that record follows tenants wherever they go. And it makes it really hard to find quality housing and affordable housing. When you have an eviction complaint on your record, you kind of take what you can get, especially if you're being denied housing left and right. And so that's why I think with this legislation, we're providing an opportunity for all tenants. For me, this is an issue that definitely disproportionately affects people of color and Black women especially. I can see that just from the waiting rooms that I'm in. But it's also an issue that doesn't really discriminate. It affects a lot of people. It affects our friends, our neighbors, like Rep. Izzy said. So this legislation, I think, can really change things for both myself and, you know, thousands of tenants in the Commonwealth. So that is also my story, and I'm sticking to it.
Thank you so much, Haley, and thank you again for sharing your story. You know, some of these can be really hard and can bring up a lot of really difficult memories. So we appreciate you, you and your time to bring this issue kind of to the forefront of what we're considering to be impactful policies for our neighbors and our community. So I'd love to turn it over to Holly now to also talk about what she's seen in court throughout the years and throughout her time.
Thank you, Jasmine. Yeah, I'm going to echo a lot of things that Haley touched on, which goes to the prevalence of these issues, not just in one community or part of the Commonwealth, it's everywhere. But first, back to who I am and what I do. I'm Holly Beck. I'm an attorney at Community Legal Services of Philadelphia. We at CLS provide legal representation to more than 10,000 people each year in a variety of different areas. I myself am in CLS's housing unit, where we represent low-income tenants facing a wide array of housing issues, including repairs, the impact of domestic violence on housing stability, folks with disabilities who need reasonable accommodations. But more than almost anything else put together, we represent tenants facing evictions. And our lawyers are in court every single day representing tenants facing eviction. So I want to talk just for a few minutes about the court process that we see that most people don't get to see because most people are not in the courthouses. And I want to echo something that Rep. Izzy said that I think bears repeating. The eviction record that we're talking about only reflects the fact that a landlord made a complaint. It doesn't include the tenant's explanation for what's happened, and it doesn't explain what happened in court. So here's what we see that most people don't. The vast majority of tenants who end up in landlord-tenant court are unrepresented, meaning they don't have an attorney to help advocate for them and explain the process to them. In Philadelphia, the vast majority of landlords are represented by counsel. The percentage is 87% of landlords in Philadelphia are represented by counsel. And when a tenant shows up, you know, let's say they have a morning case, they show up first thing in the morning, they have a few minutes to speak with their landlord or with their landlord's attorney to try to work out some kind of an agreement if there's been a misunderstanding or to, you know, work out a plan for going forward. If that takes too long, though, the tenant is going to have to go in front of a judge, and that happens the same morning. And often the trial in front of a judge just lasts a few minutes. So the tenant's entire experience in their eviction case, from the moment they walk into the court to the moment they walk out, often takes less time from beginning to end than it would take for any of us to watch like a feature-length film. That's how quick it is. everyone before me on this webinar has talked about who this process impacts by and large. Across Pennsylvania, as well as the nation, landlords disproportionately file eviction cases against households of color, people with disabilities, and women. And so those communities therefore disproportionately feel the burden of eviction records, because that's all an eviction record is the fossil memory of that eviction filing. So, you know, when thinking about how to convey what individual cases look like, when I explain to folks the cases I've seen, people are often shocked, because I tell them about the tenants we've represented who are falsely accused of missing rent payments. The court complaint will say they've missed, the past 2 or 3 months of rent. And they come to court with actually all their receipts. Most landlords will not take personal checks. They will only take money orders or electronic payments, but you have to pay a fee for an electronic payment. So many of our clients pay with money orders, and they'll come to court with an envelope of 30 money order receipts that they've meticulously saved. And I had one case where someone was accused of missing 6 months of rent, and yet the property manager's signature was on every single money order. But the process of going back and forth with the landlord and their attorney about it, because they did not have the payments on their ledger, took a shockingly long time. We represent so many folks who have fallen behind on their rent because of a single incident, a single loss of income, a single health crisis, either theirs or a family member's. And then they get back on their feet. They get more hours at work or overcome the health crisis, or a family member comes in to assist. And then, they try to make it up to their landlords with a payment plan or an application for rental assistance that, has been approved and is on the way. But then the landlord ends up filing the case anyway, because they want that payment plan or that future promise to be formalized in a court order. So even though the tenant has overcome the temporary setback, they're still being saddled with an eviction record. And then I cannot count the number of folks we represent who are just asserting their right to basic repairs. And I'm talking about, heat in winter, leaks, from the ceiling into their living rooms. I've seen photos of mold that shock the conscience. And Pennsylvania law provides for the right to basic foundational repairs in a rental. And so tenants are simply doing what they're absolutely allowed to do under the law, which is document the issue, ask for the repair repeatedly in writing. And if the landlord does not make the repair themselves, say, I'm going to withhold my rent until the repair is done. And that's often the moment we see an eviction notice, an eviction case served on the tenant in retaliation for their asserting their basic right to a habitable home. And then increasingly, right, as the housing market heated up in the last few years, a lot of landlords are just selling their buildings. And so a lot of tenants end up in housing court because their landlord is just selling the building, and they want everyone out because it's easier to sell an unoccupied building than an occupied one, where the new owner would inherit tenants. So they serve eviction notices on everyone. They file an eviction case, not alleging any wrongdoing by anybody, but just saying that the leases are over. And that's how those folks end up in court, having done absolutely nothing to even expect such a filing. And I just want to stress all of these tenants that I've described to you, every single one, regardless of whether their landlord was even right to file the case under the law, regardless of what happened in court. You know, like regardless of what they walked out of court thinking was going to happen to them, now have eviction records when they search for new housing. And so, you know, it doesn't matter how many years pass. It could be 7, 8, 9, 10 years later. It doesn't matter if the tenant now has ample income, as Haley was describing. You know, as others said, Rep. Izzy said it also, landlords often receive dozens of applications for a single unit. And so anyone with the word eviction on their background check, their application gets discarded. So that's why we're all here today. That's why this legislative effort exists. We are so excited to support Rep. Smith-Waydale's bill to limit access to eviction records, and our sincere thanks to all of you for being here and for your support of this important legislation. I'll hand it back to Jasmine.
Yeah, thanks, Holly, and thanks for giving us some insight onto what you see day in and day out in court, and how much power in the system is just not allotted to tenants to be able to tell their story or to have agency in the housing market. So appreciate your time. But now we're going to turn it over to go on to Q&A. There's been a lot of really awesome questions that have been posed in the chat, and so we're going to go to those first. And if you have any questions that you haven't asked yet, I see someone has their hand raised. If you could just type those either in the chat or the Q&A box, that would be really helpful for us. The first question is, I think I will send it over to you, Holly. Would the bill require the landlord to file the notice of satisfaction with MDJ?
Yeah, that's a great question. And to translate, for those not versed in the legal system, MDJ stands for Magisterial District Judge. Those are the county level courts. When people say housing court, that's what they mean. And yes, the bill would require, so when the bill would seal or put under restricted access any cases where, you know, there was a money judgment, but the tenant paid it off. How does the court know that the tenant paid it off? The landlord, upon receiving the final payment, is required to file a notice of satisfaction with the court. So it's a piece of paper that a landlord can fill out in less than 5 minutes that says this debt is paid, the judgment should be marked satisfied, and they can file it with the court. This bill would place an obligation on landlords to do that. Tenants can also petition on their own to do that, although of course that requires them to go and file in court. And we would like to take that burden off of tenants as much as we can if they have fulfilled their obligation in the case.
Thanks, Holly. And thanks for letting us know what these acronyms mean. Very helpful. And this next question from Jordan Casey, I think it could go to either Holly or to Rep. Izzy. Is there any discussion on adding a COVID look back to this legislation? By that, I mean sealing all of the evictions that occurred during the period of the COVID emergency. I know that various emergency protections were instituted, however, evictions still occurred. So yeah, does HB 1769 support COVID look back prevention, or?
I'll take this one. So the bill itself does not include that specific sealing, and that's not to say that it's not important. I actually think it is a thing that we have discussed, and it's a thing, frankly, that has been proposed by stakeholders on both the pro and anti side of our legislation. I think it's worthwhile, and I think from a strategic perspective, it ought to be a separate piece of legislation. And I can dive a little bit into why that is. But the broadest stroke is this. The Pennsylvania legislature, fortunately or unfortunately, is not an organization known for doing a large number of things in a given session. And so we're trying to prioritize the strategic and long-term benefits of this particular piece of legislation in getting that passed. And I think that a COVID look back is a worthwhile piece of legislation, or rather, I don't even know what I'm going to call it a jubilee because I'm Catholic and that's the reference that I have, but sort of an eviction jubilee for that time period is probably best as a separate piece of legislation. I think it has the best odds of passing. Nature of the beast, we have both pro stakeholders and opposition stakeholders to this, and this is going to roll me right into Joe's question. And so we're trying to prioritize this legislation to maximize our pro stakeholders and minimize our opposition stakeholders. I don't have a total count for you, Joe. Holly might have a better count. I can list off some of the organizations. Aaron Zapia from the Housing Alliance is working on this legislation alongside us, and we have support from organizational stakeholders such as SEIUPA, the Pennsylvania Association for Justice, that's the trial lawyers, the Pennsylvania Coalition Against Domestic Violence, that's PCADV, Regional Housing Legal Services, the Public Interest Law Center, the Community Action Association of Pennsylvania, and we're working on the ACLU and a couple of others. Holly, anybody crucial that I missed? Okay,
Thank
I'm
you
gonna
so
just,
much, Representative.
Jasmine, can I answer this next question?
Absolutely. Go ahead.
Sorry, thank you. Sorry, don't mean to be too eager. We are actually, and as you can see from the map, this is not just an urban versus rural issue. A number of our co-sponsors, for example, come from central Pennsylvania, and many of the Republicans that we've been able to negotiate with, frankly, come from, pardon me, places as, both Dauphin County and Armstrong County. And so it's an ongoing negotiation to move them to support. But I think that's, if I can be ever so frank with you, the stakeholders don't want it. Legislators from all across the Commonwealth recognize that this is important for both urban and rural issues. And I mean, like, the thing is that rural homelessness simply does not get the attention that it deserves in many of our conversations. So yeah, it ought to be a priority for them as well. Thank you, Jasmine.
Oh, thank you so much, Rep. Izzy, for taking on that question. You know better than us who's supporting this work. So I'd love to. These have been awesome questions. And Mark, there's a reason why we left yours for last, because our call to action. So we'd love to share some resources on how to get involved or learn more. Holly, how can people get involved or learn more?
Thank you. Thank you all for staying to the bitter end. I hope you will take the follow-up survey that is going to be sent out to everybody who registered for this webinar. In that survey, there'll be an option to check yes to stay involved with this campaign. Please check yes. Please share what you've learned today with your colleagues, friends, and peers. And I'm putting a link in the chat. If you don't know who your state reps are, there's no shame in that. Today's the perfect day to learn. Please contact your state reps and encourage them to seal eviction records and support HB 1769, the Ready to Rent Act. We have a social media toolkit that we'll put in the chat, and we can also send out in the follow-up email, so that folks can share these tools, this campaign with your networks. And if you work at an organization, we would be so grateful if you spoke with your leadership about the possibility of writing a letter of support. And that would help us really demonstrate the size of our coalition. So please feel free to contact me directly about writing a letter of support if that feels like a possibility to you. I will put my email in the chat. Yeah, back to you, Jasmine.
Yeah, thank you so much. And with the last few or minute, I want to encourage you all to also join our future conversations that are happening this month, this Housing Futures Month, to continue conversations about fair housing. We have a webinar coming up on the 30th to celebrate Housing Futures Month called Radical Homecoming. And then another one on April 29th to talk about AFFH and the Fair Housing Act's promise through the AFFH rule, the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing Rule. I want to thank you all so much for your time today on a Friday afternoon or morning. I hope you all have a great weekend, and we'll see you next time.